The Blue Parrot. In a part of Arabia where groves of palms and sweet-scented flowers give the traveler rest after toilsome journeys under the burning skies, there reigned a young king whose name was Lino. He had grown up under the wise rule of his father, who had lately died, and though he was only 19, he did not believe, like many young men, that he must change all the laws in order to show how clever he was, but was content with the old ways which had made the people happy and the country prosperous. There was only one fault that his subjects had to find in him, and that was that he did not seem to be in any hurry to get married, in spite of the prayers that they frequently offered him. The neighboring kingdom was governed by the Swan Fairy, who had only a daughter, Princess Hermosa, who was as charming in her way as Lino was in his. The Swan Fairy always had an ambassador at the young king's court, and hearing the grumbles of the citizens that Lino showed no signs of taking a wife, the good man resolved that he would try his hand at matchmaking. "For," he said, "is there anyone living who is worthy of the Princess Hermosa he is found here? At any rate, I can but try and bring them together." Now, of course, it was not proper to offer the princess in marriage, and the difficulty was to work upon the unconscious king as to get the proposal to come from him. But the ambassador, as well as used to the ways of the court, and after several conversations on the art of painting, which Lino loved, he led to the talk of portraits, and mentioned carelessly that a particularly fine picture had lately been made of his own princess. "Though, as for likeness," he concluded, "perhaps it is hardly as good as the small miniature which was painted a year ago." The king took it and looked at it closely. "Ah," he sighed, "that must be flattered. It cannot be possible that any woman should be such a miracle of beauty." "If only you could see her," answered the ambassador. The king did not reply, but the ambassador was not at all surprised when, the following morning, he was sent for into the royal presence. "Since you showed me that picture," began Lino, almost before the door was shut, "I have not been able to banish the face of the princess from my thoughts. I've summoned you here to inform you that I am about to send envoys to the court of the Swan Fairy asking her for her daughter in marriage." "I cannot, as you well understand, speak for my mistress in so important a matter," replied the ambassador, stroking his beard in order to conceal the satisfaction he felt. "But I know that she will certainly entertain and highly gratified at your proposal." "If that is so," returned the king, his whole face beaming with joy, "then instead of sending envoys, I will go myself and take you with me. In 3 days my preparations will be made, and we will set out." Unluckily for Lino, he had a neighbor on the other side, who was a powerful magician named Asmanor, who was the king of the Isle of Lions and the father of a hideous daughter whom he thought was the most beautiful creature that ever existed. Riquette, for such was her name, had also fallen in love with the portrait, but it was of King Lino, and she implored her father to give him to her for a husband. As Menor, who considered that no man who lived was worthy of his treasure, was about to send his chief minister to King Lino on the mission, when the news reached him that the king was already started for the court of the Swan Fairy. Riquette was thrown into transports of grief and implored her father to prevent the marriage, which Asmanor promised to do, and calling for an ugly and humpbacked little dwarf named Rabbit, he performed some spells which transported them quickly into a rocky valley through which the king and his escort were bound to pass. When the tramp of horses was heard, the magician took out an enchanted handkerchief, which rendered invisible anyone who touched it. Giving one end to Rabbit and holding the other himself, they walked unseen among the horsemen, but not a trace of Lino was to be found. And this was natural enough because the king, tired out with the excitement and fatigue of the last few days, had bidden the heavy coaches laden with presents for the princess to go forward while he rested under the palms with a few friends. Here, as men were beheld them, all sound asleep, and carrying a spell which prevented their waking till he wished them to do so, he stripped the king of all his clothes and dressed him in those of Rabbit, whom he touched with his ring, saying, "Take the shape of Lino until you have wedded the daughter of the Swan Fairy." And so great was this magician's power that Rabbit positively believed himself to really be the king. When the groom had mounted Lino's horse and had ridden out to the sights, Esmenor roused the king, who stared with astonishment at the dirty garments in which he was dressed. But before he had time to look about him, the magician caught him up in a cloud and carried him off to his daughter. Meantime, Rabbit had come up to the others, who never guessed for a moment that it was not their own master. "I'm hungry," he said. "Give me something to eat at once." "May it please your majesty," answered the steward, "the tents are not even set up, and it will be at least an hour before your supper is served. Well thought—" "Who taught you to think?" interrupted the false king rudely. "You are nothing but a fool. Give me some horse's flesh directly. It is the best meat in the world." The steward could hardly believe his ears. King Lino, the most polite man under the sun, to speak to his faithful servant in such a manner, and to want horse's flesh too. Why, he was so delicate in his appetite that he lived mostly on fruit and cakes. Well, there was no knowing what people would do to come by, and anyway, he must obey at once, if he wished to keep his head on his shoulders. Perhaps, after all, it was love which had driven him mad, and if so, by and by, he might come around right again. Whatever excuses his old servants might invent for the master, by the time the procession had reached the Swan Fairy's capital, there were no more horses left, and they were forced to walk up to the palace on foot. Hiding their surprise as best they could, they begged the king to follow them, and dismounted from their own horses, as he, they supposed, preferred to walk. They soon perceived the Swan Fairy and her daughter awaiting them on a low balcony, under which the king stopped. "Madam," he said, "you may be surprised that I have come to ask your daughter's hand in ceremoniousness fashion, but the journey is long, and I was hungry and ate my horse, which is the best meat in the world, and I forced my courtiers to eat theirs too, but for all that I am a great king, and wish to be your son-in-law. And now that is settled, where is Hermosa?" "Sire," answered the queen, not a little amazed by the king's manner, which was so different from anything she had been led to expect, "you possess my daughter's portrait, and it can have made but little impression on you if you don't recognize her at once." "I don't remember any portraits," replied Rabbit, "but perhaps it may be in my pocket after all." And he searched everywhere, while the ladies-in-waiting looked on in astonishment, but of course found nothing. When he had finished, he turned to the princess, who stood there blushing and angry, and said, "If it is you whom I come to marry, I think you are very beautiful, and I am sure that even if I had seen your portrait, I should have remembered it. Let us have the wedding as soon as possible, and meantime I should like to go to sleep, for your country is very different from mine, and I assure you that after walking over stones and sand for days and days, one needs a little rest." And without waiting for a reply, he bade one of his pages to conduct him to his room, where he was soon snoring so loud that he could be heard at the other end of town. As soon as he was out of sight, the poor princess flung herself into her mother's arms and burst into tears. For 15 days she had had King Lindo's portrait constantly before her, while the letter from their own ambassador speaking of the young man's grace and charm had never left her pocket. True, the portrait was faithful enough, but how could that fair outside contain so rough and rude of soul. Yet this she might have even forgotten had the king shown any signs of love or admiration to which she had been so long accustomed. As for her mother, the poor Swan Fairy was so bewildered at the extraordinary manners of the new son-in-law that she was almost speechless. Matters were in this state when King Lino's chamberlain begged for a private audience with Her Majesty, and no sooner were they alone than he told her that he feared that his master had suddenly gone mad, or had fallen under the spell of some magician. "I've been lost in astonishment before," he said, "but now that he has failed to recognize the princess, and no longer possesses her portrait, which he never would part for a single instant, my amazement knows no bounds. Perhaps, madam, your fairy gifts may be able to discover the reason for this change in one whose courtesy was the talk of the kingdom." And with a low bow, he took his departure. The queen stood where the chamberlain left her, thinking deeply. Suddenly her face cleared, and going to an old chest which she kept in a secret room, she drew from it a small mirror. On this mirror she could see faithfully reflected whatever she wished, and at this moment she desired above all things to behold King Lino as he really was. The chamberlain was right. It was not he who was lying on the bed snoring till the whole palace shook beneath him. No, this was her real son-in-law, a man dressed in dirty clothes and imprisoned in one of Ismore's strongest towers, kissing the portrait of Formosa, which had escaped the wizard's notice, owing to the young man having worn it for better concealment, having tied amongst his hair. Calling hastily to her daughter, she bade her look also, and Hermosa had the pleasure of gazing on Lino, who was behaving exactly as she could have wished. The mirror was still in her hand when the door of the prison opened, and there entered the hideous Riquette, who, from her upraised eyes, seemed to be begging for Lino some favor that he refused to grant. Of course, Hermosa and her mother could not hear the words, but from Riquette's angry face as she left the room, it was not difficult to guess what had happened. But the mirror had more to tell, for it appeared that in fury of her rejections by the king, Riquette had ordered 4 strong men to scourge him until he fainted, which was done in the sight of Hermosa, who in horror dropped the mirror and would have fallen had she not been caught by her mother. "Control yourself, my child," she said. "We need not all of our wits if we are going to rescue the king from the power of those wicked people. At first, it's necessary to know who that man is that has taken the name and his real face." Then, picking up the mirror, she wished to have the sight to behold the false lover, and she gave back the vision of a dirty, greasy groom lying, dressed as he was, on her bed of state. "So this is a trick Ismenor hoped to play on us. Well, we have our revenge, whatever it will cost us to get it. Only we must be careful not to let him guess that he has deceived us, for his use of magic is greater than mine, and I shall have to be very patient. To begin with, I must leave you, and if the false king wakes and asks where I am, then answer I have gone to settle some affairs on the border of my kingdom. Meanwhile, be sure to treat him most politely and arrange fetes to amuse him. If he shows any sign of being suspicious, you can even give him to understand that on your marriage I intend to give up the crown to your husband. And now, farewell." So saying, the Swan Fairy waved her hand, and a cloud came down and concealed her, and nobody imagined that the beautiful white cloud that was blown so rapidly across the sky was actually the chariot that was carrying the Swan Fairy to the Tower of Esmenor. Now the tower was situated in the midst of a forest, and the queen thought that under cover of the dark trees it would be quite easy for her to drop to earth unseen. But the tower was so thoroughly enchanted that the more she tried to reach the ground, the tighter something tried to hold her back. At length, by putting forth all the power she possessed, she managed to descend to the foot of the tower, and there, weak and faint as she was with her excursions, she lost no time in working her spells, and found that she could only overcome Esmenor by means of a stone from the ring of Gygus. But how was she to get this ring? For the magic book told her that Esmenor guarded it night and day among his most precious treasures. However, get it she must, and in the meantime the first step was to see the royal prisoner himself. So drawing out her tablets, she wrote as follows. The bird which brings you this letter is a Swan Fairy, mother of Hermosa, who loves you as much as you love her. And after this assurance, she related the wicked plot of which she had been seen the victim. Then, quickly changing herself into a swallow, she began to fly around the tower, till she discovered the window of Leno's prison. It was so high that the bars seemed needless, especially as 4 soldiers were stationed at the passage outside. Therefore, the fairy was able to enter and even hop on his shoulder. But he was so much occupied with gazing at the princess's portrait that it was some time before she could attract his attention. At last she gently scratched his ear with the corner of the note, and he looked around with a start. On perceiving the swallow, he knew at once that help had come, and tearing open the letter, he wept with joy at seeing the words it contained, and asked 1,000 questions as to Hermosa, which the swallow was unable to answer, though, by repeated nods, she signed him to read further. Must I indeed pretend to wish to marry the horrible Riquet? He cried, when he had finished. Can I obtain the stone with the magician? Accordingly, the next morning, when Riquet paid him her daily visit, he received her much more graciously than usual. The magician's daughter could not contain her delight at the change, and in answer to her expressions of joy, Leno told her that he had had a dream by which he had learned the inconsistency of Hermosa, also that a fairy had appeared and informed him that if he wished to break the bonds which bound him to the faithless princess, and transfer his affections to the daughter of Ismenor, he must have in his possession for a day and a night the stone from the ring of Gygus, now in the possession of the magician. This news so enchanted Riquet that she flung her arms around the king's neck and embraced him tenderly, greatly to his disgust, as he would infinitely have preferred to the sticks of the soldiers. However, there was no help for it, and he did his best to seem pleased, till Riquet relieved him by announcing that she must lose no time in asking her father and obtaining from him this precious stone. His daughter's request came at a great surprise to Esmenor, whose suspicions were instantly excited. But think as he would, he could not see by any means that the king, so closely guarded, might have held communication with the Swan Fairy. Still, he would do nothing hastily, and hiding his dismay, he told Riquet that his wish was only to make her happy, and that as she wished so much for the stone, he would fetch it for her. Then he went to the closet where all his spells were worked, and in a short time he discovered that his enemy the Swan Fairy was at that moment inside his palace. So that is it, he said, smiling grimly. We shall see who's well, she shall have the stone by all means, but a stone that will turn everyone who touches it into marble. And placing a small ruby in a box, he returned to his daughter. Here's a talisman which will gain you the love of King Leno, he said. But be sure you give it to him in the box unopened, or else the stone will lose all its virtue. With a cry of joy, Riquet snatched the box from his hands and ran off to the prison, followed by her father, who, holding tightly into the enchanted handkerchief, was able, unseen, to watch the working of the spell. As he expected, at the foot of the tower stood the Swan Fairy, who had had the impudence to appear in her natural shape, waiting for the stone which the prince was to throw to her. Eagerly she caught the box as it fell from the prince's hand. No sooner had her fingers touched the ruby Then a curious hardening came over her, and her limbs stiffened, and her tongue could hardly utter the words.
We are betrayed.
Yes, you are betrayed, cried Esmondor in a terrible voice. And you, he continued, dragging the king to the window, you shall turn into a parrot, and a parrot you will remain until you can persuade Hermosa to crush in your hand. He had hardly finished before a blue parrot flew out of the forest, and the magician, mounting his winged chariot, set off for the Isle of Swans, where he changed everyone into statues, exactly into positions in which he found them, not even excepting Rabbit himself. Only Hermosa was spared, and her he ordered to get into the chariot beside him. In a few minutes he had reached the Forest of Wonders, when the magician got down and dragged the unhappy princess after him. I have changed your mother into a stone, and your lover into a parrot, he said. And you are to become a tree, and a tree you will remain until you have crushed the head of the person you love best in the world. But I will leave you your mind and memory, that your tortures may be increased 1,000-fold. Great magician as he was, Esmenor could not have invented a more terrible fate had he tried for 100 years. The hours passed wearily by for the poor princess, who longed for a woodcutter's axe to put an end to her misery. How were they to be delivered from their doom? And how, even supposing that King Lino didn't fly that way, there were thousands of blue parrots in the forest, and how was she to know him, or he her? As to her mother, alas, that was too bad to think about, so being a woman, she kept on thinking. Meanwhile, the blue parrot flew around the world, making friends wherever he met, till one day he entered the castle of an old wizard who had just married a beautiful young wife, Grenadine, for which was her name, and led a very dull life and delighted to have playfellows, so she gave him a golden cage to sleep in and delicious fruits to eat. Only in one way did he disappoint her. He would never talk as the other parrots did.
If you only knew how happy it would make me, I'm sure you would try,
She was fond of saying, but the parrot did not seem to hear her. One morning, however, she left the room to gather some flowers, and the parrot, finding himself alone, hopped to the table, and picking up a pencil, wrote some verses on a piece of paper. He had just finished when he was startled by a noise, and letting fall the pencil, he flew out of the window. Now, hardly had he dropped the pencil when the wizard lifted the corner of the curtain which hung in the doorway, and advanced into the room. Seeing the paper on the table, he picked it up, and was his great surprise as he read. Fair princess, to win your grace I will hold discourse with you. Silence so, where more than a place than chattering like a cockatoo.
I half expected it was enchanted,
murmured the wizard to himself, and he fetched his books and searched them, and found that instead of being a parrot, the bird was really a king who had fallen under the wrath of a magician, and the magician whom the wizard hated most in the world. Eagerly he read on, seeking some means of breaking the enchantment, and at last, to his great joy, discovered the remedy. Then he hurried to his wife, who was lying on some cushions under the tree on which the parrot had perched, and informed her that her favorite was really the king of a great country, and that if she would whistle for the bird, they would all go together to a certain spot in the Forest of Miracles,
where will restore him to his own shape. Only you must not be afraid to cry out, whatever I do, he added, or everything will be spoilt.
The wizard's wife jumped up in an instant, and so delighted she was, and began to whistle along that the parrot loved. But as he did not wish to be known that he had been listening, then the conversation waited till she had turned her back, when he flew down the tree and alighted on her shoulder. Then they got into the golden boat, which carried them to a clearing in the forest, where 3 tall trees stood by themselves.
I want these trees for my magic fire, he said to his wife. Put the parrot on that branch. He will be quite safe. And go yourself to a little distance. If you stay too near, you may get your head crushed by the fall.
At these words, the parrot suddenly remembered the prophecy of Ismenor and held himself ready. His heart beating, and thoughts of one of these trees beheld Hermosa. Meanwhile, the magician took a spade and loosened the earth and the roots of the trees so that they might all fall together. Directly the parrot observed them totter, he spread his wings and flew right under the middle one, which was the most beautiful of the three. There was a crash, and Lino and Hermosa stood facing each other, clasped hand in hand. After the first few moments, the princess' thoughts returned to her mother, and falling at the feet of the magician, who was smiling with delight at the success of the plan, she implored him to help them at once more, and to give the Swan Fairy back her proper shape.
That is not so easy, he said, but I will try what I can do.
And transporting himself to his palace to obtain a little bottle of poisoned water, he waited till nightfall, and started at once more to Esmenor's tower. Of course, had Esmenor consulted his books, he would have seen what his enemy was doing. He might have protected himself, but he had been eating and drinking too much, and had gone to bed, sleeping heavily. Changing himself into a bat, the magician flew into the room, and hiding himself in the curtains, he poured all the liquid over Esmenor's face, so that he died without a groan. At the same instant, the Swan Fairy became a woman again, for no magician, however powerful, can work spells which last beyond his life. So when the Swan Fairy returned to her capital, she found all her courtiers waiting at the gate to receive her, and in their midst, beaming with happiness, Hermosa and King Lino. Standing behind them, though a long way off, was Rabbit, but his dirty clothes had given peace to clean ones, when his earnest desire was granted, and the princess had made him head of her stables. And here we must bid them farewell, feeling sure that they will have many years of happiness before them after the terrible trials through which they had passed.